On today's Locked On Giants podcast, what did we learn from episode 3 of Hard Knocks? I'm going to give you the key takeaways as well as my thoughts on what was revealed in the episode. That's coming your way next here on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Today's Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for Giants on SI. You can find the written work over at si.com/NFL/Giants. And as always, welcome on into my Blue Crew community members, to my everydayers, to my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's episode 3 of Hard Knocks is in the books. And you know what, folks? Initially, when I watched it, and I watched the episode twice, I get the advanced screeners from HBO and Warner Brothers. And when I initially watched it, I thought, what a boring episode. But when I watched it back a second time, it was really jam-packed with a lot of interesting information. So, as I always do, I'm going to give you some key takeaways, some summary from the episode. So spoiler alerts, if you haven't seen the episode and you plan on watching it, you probably want to come back to this podcast a little later after you've watched it. And we'll just run through the list, and I'll tell you, what kind of surprised me and, what the ramifications might mean with regards to what unfolded. So that being said, up first, we're going to talk about the Saquon Barkley deal. Now, the Saquon Barkley saga was finally wrapped up in episode 3. Episode 3 was primarily based on, or focused on, I should say, free agency. So Saquon Barkley, there was a big question of, did he keep his word to the New York Giants in that, did he go back or have his agent go back to the Joe Schoen, the general manager, and, say, hey, look, this is the best deal that we got on the open market. What do you want to do? And the answer is yes, they did go back to Schoen. Now, just to kind of fill you in a little bit here, the Giants never made a formal offer to Saquon Barkley this past free agency cycle. All right. I'm not talking about last year when there were a few offers put on the table and Barkley rejected it. So basically in the episode, you saw Joe Schoen having conversations with Ed Berry, who is Saquon Barkley's agent. And interestingly, by the way, those calls were not recorded on Berry's side. Whereas in the first, episode 2, there was a call between Schoen and Berry that was recorded, and you could hear both of the both sides of the conversation. Whereas in this episode, you did not hear both sides of the conversation. You did not hear Berry's side. So anyway, there was one such phone call between Schoen and Berry where basically Schoen, was asked by Berry, look, what are you thinking of offering this guy in order to keep him? And Schoen said, at least this is my interpretation based on, Schoen's responses. But Schoen said to Berry, look, that's why I'm letting him test the market. Let the market set his rate and we'll go from there. So long story short, they did test the market. There was a big market for Saquon Barkley. He got lucrative offers and whatnot. And Berry came back to Schoen and said to him, okay, we've got this offer. It's a little bit more than what I initially told you. And I think what he initially told him was 3 years, $12.5 million average APY, $25 million guaranteed. So Barkley got that deal, I believe, from the Eagles. I think that's what his current deal that he signed with the Eagles breaks down to. And Berry, again, this is my interpretation based on Shane's responses. Berry basically said, look, if you want to keep Saquon, you're going to have to go north of that. and Shane just wasn't going to go there. Now, here's the thing that I think a lot of people did not take into consideration at the time. While Barkley was shopping his services around, trying to get offers, Shane wasn't just sitting on his hands waiting to hear back from Barry or Saquon. He was out trying to beef up the offensive line, add players to the team. And the issue here is that, even though the Giants got this unexpected windfall from the cap being a lot higher than they thought it would be, they were using up cap resources. So, meanwhile, Shane's out there and he's signing offensive linemen. He's looking into other running backs in the event that, Saquon doesn't come back, or knowing that Matt Breida wouldn't be back. And now all the money is starting to evaporate. So by the time Barry came back and said, hey, you're going to have to go a little bit north of $12.5 million to keep Saquon, Shane couldn't do it even if he wanted to. So that's I think a point that a lot of people overlook. I know it's something I didn't think of when I was, kind of breaking all this stuff down. So anyway, there was never an offer made, like I said, by the Giants. There was a ballpark figure that Shane had in mind. Obviously, he had a walk away point because, when Barry gave him the number and Shane said, look, I'm out, I can't do it. So that's kind of how that situation resolved itself. Now, another thing in this saga, John Mara, the COO, kept saying, look, I really wish we could find a way to bring Barkley back. He's our most popular player, most popular player we've had in a while. And I know that there's this narrative out there that John Mara interferes and, imposes his will on Joe Shane. Folks, if you haven't learned by now, by watching this episode, that is not true, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, Joe Shane at the end of the day made the decision on Barkley. Yes, John Mara put his 2 cents in, but John Mara also let Shane do his job. And, he didn't sit there and say, you have to bring this guy back. No, he let him do his job. He let him do what was in the best interest of the organization, which, maybe Mara didn't agree with it, but it is what it is. He let him do his job. So that being said, Saquon is now an Eagle. The Giants went out and they got Devin Singletary. Now, interestingly, when Brian Daboll and Joe Shane were looking at potential running backs to sign, it looked like on his board, and Shane had has a whiteboard, a magnetic whiteboard, where he posted names of players in each position that they were targeting. And the top 2 guys that they were targeting at the running back position, Devin Singletary and DeAndre Swift, who was with the Eagles last year. And I suspect, because this wasn't clear in the episode, but I suspect because they had familiarity with Devin Singletary, that's where they went, why they went with him. That and also the price. So that's kind of how that played out. So that being said, we now have, the conclusion of the Saquon Barkley story. He did come back to the Giants. He had his agent come back and say, look, this is what it's going to take to potentially get this deal done. And that was the end of it. They couldn't do it. So onward and upward, as they say. All right, coming up next, we still got to talk about the Drew Lock sales pitch. That was clarified. The Brian Burns trade, some details emerging there, the offensive line, and the teaser for the next episode dropped a very, very interesting nugget. And I'm going to tell you all about that right after this. Hey, Giant fans, pretty soon the NFL season will be here, and it promises to be packed with loads of action. And speaking of action, there's still plenty of sports going on at the moment with Major League Baseball, the WNBA, NASCAR, and so much more. And right now, when you sign up for an account with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, you can keep the action going whenever you want. Simply download and open their app and place your bets on a wide variety of props, odds, money lines, and more. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So go on and head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and coming up this week on the Locked On Giants podcast, remember I told you yesterday, if you're an everydayer, you would remember this. I said I would have a guest on the show this week. Well, I can now tell you who the guest is going to be. It is Sean Stiletto. That's right, the agent for Tommy Cutlets. He's going to be my guest coming up later in the week. I think this is probably the first time I've had an active NFL agent come on the show. And, that should be an interesting conversation because we can kind of find out a little bit behind the scenes regarding what an agent actually does and the challenges and all that stuff. So it's a nice little change of pace before we get into the hectic turn of the of training camp, which starts next week. The rookies did report today, Tuesday. I posted a short for those of you who missed it that tight end Theo Johnson was placed on PUP. So we'll get into all this stuff, obviously, as we get a little further into next week and closer to training camp. So let's get back to Hard Knocks, episode 3, what we learned. And they covered the free agency period, as I mentioned before, and Drew Lock came up, the topic of Drew Lock. Now, initially, the quarterback situation, Brian Dable, if he had his druthers, wanted to keep the quarterback room the same as it was last year, which meant keeping Tyrod Taylor on the roster. Well, that unfortunately wasn't going to happen because the Jets came in and up, what they were willing to offer, Taylor versus what the Giants were willing to offer them. So the Giants, in looking at backup quarterbacks, they had their eye on, I think it was 3 guys. It was Drew Lock, it was Gardner Minshew, and Sam Darnold. Minshew was too expensive. Shane said that right off the bat that he was probably going to be out of their ballpark. And if I'm not mistaken, he signed a pretty hefty deal. I think 2 years, $25 million, I want to say, with the Raiders. Then you had Darnold, who signed, I believe, 1 year, $10 million with the Vikings. So Drew Lock, they were able to get for 1 year, $5 million plus an additional $3 million in playtime incentives. Now, here's the thing you need to know about this particular storyline. Seattle's GM, John Schneider, on a podcast a few months ago, made a comment saying that the Giants sold Drew Lock on the ability to come in and be the starter. And the Giants denied that. Drew Lock denied it. And everybody was like, oh, they're just saying that because they don't want to ruffle Daniel Jones's feathers. Here's the conversation that actually took place. What the Giants sold Drew Lock on was, okay, you look at Mitchell Trubisky, you look at Tyrod Taylor, both of whom worked under Brian Dable for about a year, at least a year. And then both of them went on and got paid handsomely from their next team. So that was an initial sales pitch made to Drew Lock. The other thing that was made to Drew Lock as a sales pitch, and this is actually something that Lock talked about during the OTAs. They said, look, Daniel Jones is still rehabbing, so you're going to come in and you're basically going to be our number 1 quarterback while Daniel is still rehabbing, which means during the OTAs, during the mandatory minicamp, you're going to take all the first team reps and you're going to get valuable experience so that if you do have to play at some point in the season, you're not going to come in and be, ice cold and wondering what the heck's going on or have to worry about building chemistry or anything like that. And that was something Drew Lock actually said when he talked to the media this past spring. He actually talked about that and how valuable that was to him. So that was pretty much the sales pitch that the Giants made to Drew Lock to bring him over. And, here he is. And we'll see if Daniel Jones is ready for the start of camp. All signs are pointing to him being fully ready. And but I still think that Drew Lock, we're going to see a lot of him in the preseason games because I question whether or not the Giants are going to actually put Daniel Jones out there in meaningless preseason games and risk a potential injury given the guy's history. So we'll see how that plays out. All right, let's move on now to the Brian Burns trade. The Brian Burns trade, as we know, the Giants got this guy. The Panthers initially were looking to get 2 number 1s. And Shane wasn't budging. So then they changed it to a number 2, and they kind of went back and forth. I think the Giants initially proposed a number 2, meaning a second round pick rather. The Panthers wanted a little bit more. So Shane was like, okay, What if we do a second rounder and a pick next year? And they were still haggling and whatnot. Ultimately, the Panthers, they came back to Shane and they said to him, okay, we'll do a second round this year. We'll do maybe a pick next year, but we also want a seventh rounder. Now, the Giants don't have a seventh rounder or didn't have a seventh rounder this year because they had traded it last year for Isaiah Simmons to the Cardinals. So Shane basically told Dan Morgan on the phone, hey, look, dude, I need players too. What are you talking about? You're drafting one, I'm drafting sixth in the order. Why do you want my seventh round pick? Or not that the Giants, again, had a seventh round pick, but he was trying to tell him that, look, you have a higher pick than us. So why do you want to compound it? Ultimately, Shane got Morgan to drop the request for a seventh rounder. And the two teams, the trade terms were the Giants sent the higher of their two second-round picks to the Panthers. They swapped fifth-round picks this past year, and they sent the Panthers a fifth-round pick next year on the condition that if the Giants should end up with multiple fifth-round picks, the Panthers would get the higher or the highest of the batch. So that was the final terms of that deal. The Giants, of course, getting Brian Burns and, having to pay him a lot of money. And a couple of interesting things to come out of that. Basically Shane told defensive coordinator Shane Bowen, he said, look, I can get you Burns, but that's pretty much it as far as, the resources I have available. And Bowen was like, hey, dude, I'm fine with that. I plan on playing this guy a ton anyway. So, he was happy with that. Now, had this deal not gone through, Shane made a comment. He said, we'll probably have to go into the draft and draft an edge rusher. So edge rusher all along was on the Giants' to-do list. It was just a matter of getting a veteran or, drafting a guy. And the reason why they were so, enthralled with Burns, young guy under 28 years old. Brandon Brown, by the way, made these points, which I thought were pretty good. Under 28 years old, a guy who had more sacks than the other members in his draft class and who was a pretty good, upstanding citizen. So all those things made Brian Burns worth the investment for the Giants, who said, look, it's very rare that you see that kind of guy come available on the market. So that's why they kind of jumped on that. And then I think it was I want to say it was Brown. I'm not sure. I heard the voice, but I couldn't match up the face because they didn't show the guy's face. But someone made the comment that, we bring in a pass rusher. Now that takes some of the onus off of the young secondary, which is something I've been telling you guys on various shows when I've talked about the secondary. Having a strong front seven, adding Burns with Kayvon Thibodeau and Dexter Lawrence. Now they've got a formidable pass rush, and that should help take some of the pressure off that young defensive secondary. So that was the whole goal behind that, amongst other things. Obviously, getting somebody who could harass the quarterback and force a pick your own poison type of scenario was also important. Okay, now coming up, we've got a few more things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the offensive line, and there was a surprise nugget dropped in the preview for episode number 4 that we've got to talk about. I found this one to be very interesting and something I didn't even know. I mean, this was news to me. So I'm going to tell you all about it when we come back right after this. Hey, Giant fans, when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They help you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but who might be open to the perfect role. 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours when they use LinkedIn. And did you know that LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier? They've launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. Find out why over 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring by posting your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we are recapping Hard Knocks, episode 3. Not just what happened, but some takeaways, kind of to fill in some of the gaps and give you a little bit more context into what the episode shows. So now we're going to turn our attention to the offensive line. And look, coming out of the 2023 season, was it any shock that the Giants needed to address the offensive line? So, in the episode, you saw Brian Dable sitting in Joe Shane's office and saying, look, I need interior guys, because that's where the Giants were weakest on the offensive line, believe it or not, was in the interior, specifically at the guards. So, in realizing that, the Giants identified 3 potential candidates for the offensive line: Jermaine Illuminor, John Runyon Jr., and Robert Hunt, who I believe was with the Dolphins. All right. So in planning this, and oh, by the way, there was a little nugget dropped by Chris Rossetti, who I think has been the star of the show so far. Chris Rossetti said, look, if we get Illuminor, we have potentially either our starting left guard or our starting right tackle. So all along, they kind of looked at Illuminor and they said, look, if we get this guy, he's going to start off as our left guard. And if Evan Neal doesn't pan out, we'll move him to right tackle. And I mentioned that because a while ago, I think I had mentioned Illuminor for left guard. This was before, we saw him playing left guard in the spring. And a lot of you are like, no, Pat, he's going to play right guard. And I'm like, no, he's going to play left guard. And, this kind of syncs up with what I was told because Rossetti basically confirmed it at the time. So anyway, so they had their eye on those 3 guys, Illuminor, Hunt, and Runyon. The problem is that the Jets also had their eye on a couple of those guys, specifically Runyon. And, there was that whole Aaron Rodgers, Nathaniel Hackett, Green Bay connection that the Jets were trying to sell John Runyon Jr. on. At the end of the day, the Giants had to offer Runyon a little bit more money than I think that they wanted to. I think it was like $1 million extra because the Jets had put an offer on the table. And, Runyon's agent came back to the Giants and said, look, we've got this offer from the Jets. If you want him, what can you do? So they gave the Giants a chance to up the offer, which they did. And remember what I said now in the first segment, when I talked about, Saquon and how every time the Giants agreed to terms with a new guy, that shrunk the pot available for Saquon. Not that Shane was going to go over $10 million for Saquon, but, he was going to maybe see if they could meet somewhere in the middle. That's my belief at any rate, that they would maybe try and meet somewhere in the middle to see if, Saquon was really serious about being, a Giant for life. So they wrapped up John Runyon Jr., but in the process, Robert Hunt became too expensive for them. They turned their attention to Jermaine Illuminor. And what was odd about that, what was surprising, and I didn't know this, is that the Giants actually wanted to offer Jermaine Illuminor, who I believe is going to turn 30 this year. They wanted to give him a 3-year deal, but Illuminor only wanted a 2-year deal. I don't know why that is. I tried thinking, to think about, why might that have been? And I can't right now at any rate come up with a conceivable reason why that might have been the case. But that's what Illuminor signed for. And, I think if you followed him on social media, you see how happy he is to be a Giant. So now you kind of wonder, is he maybe sorry that he went with 2 years as opposed to 3? If I ever get a chance, I might ask him about that. I don't know him quite well just yet to ask him, but if I do get to know him a little bit better, I might say, hey, why'd you want 2 years instead of 3? Because I'd be curious about that, because it would have meant more guaranteed money, a little bit more security spread out over, 3 years. So I don't know what the reasoning is there, but, like I said, if I ever get a chance, I'll try and ask Jermaine about that and see if he's willing to tell me. So that's where the Giants were at with the offensive line. Hunt would have been nice to have, but, they couldn't afford him. It was that simple. So they did get, like I said, having Illuminor, having Runyon to be the starters. Now, if Illuminor has to play right tackle for Evan Neal because Evan Neal isn't ready or he wets the bed, they've got Aaron Stinney they brought on. They brought on Austin Schlottman. So they do have other options to plug in there. And I think Aaron Stinney would probably be the first guy off the bench if they have to move Illuminor over to right tackle. And let's also not forget Joshua Azudo, though. Azudo, I think, they're grooming him to kind of be what I call the David Deal, even though, he's got a ways to go before he's of David Deal's, quality when David was in his prime. But David, could play both tackle spots back in the day. He could play both guard spots. So he was a utility man for the Giants. And I think that's maybe what the Giants are looking to do with Joshua Azudu. All right. So that's the offensive line. Now, as is usually the case or has been the case with these episodes, I thought the preview for episode 4 dropped a really, really juicy nugget. Again, spoiler alert. If you do not want to be spoiled for episode 4, stop listening right now. Okay? Because this one is really juicy. There may have been, it seems, a surprise quarterback in the mix that the Giants were talking about for the draft. Now, in the upcoming preview, they showed all the Giants head brass, senior brass, the two owners, Shane, Dable, the top lieutenants, if you will. They were in Shane's office before the start of the draft. And this because they were all dressed in their suits and basically they wore the same clothes that they wore for the first night of the draft. And Shane was talking and he said, look, our plan is, and let me just get the exact quote here so I don't misquote it. He's like, okay, the plan is if we don't get a quarterback here, we'll roll with Daniel Jones and try to get him a weapon. Are we good with that? And I don't know, who responded, yep, but somebody in the room said, yep. So that was the plan. They were looking to get a quarterback in this draft. Now, before this scene aired, they showed Shane and his personnel lieutenants in a meeting. And he said, okay, guys, let's talk about, Jaden Daniels here. Jaden Daniels, of course, the LSU quarterback. And the topic was, would you guys be comfortable trading up to get Jaden Daniels? And Brian Dable perked up and he said, Daniels? And they're like, yeah. He goes, I would. And you can also hear in the background other people in the room saying, oh, yeah, yeah. So, we always been under the impression that it was Drake May or bust for the Giants because, they saw the Giants going to New England in episode 2, trying to get them, to say, hey, we'll call you if we're thinking of trading. And that didn't pan out. But apparently the Giants had their eyes on Jaden Daniels, who went number 2 to Washington. So why is this, important? Besides the fact that, Daniels wasn't really linked to the Giants as much as Drake May was. But this is what it tells me, folks. And look, some of you accuse me of being anti-Daniel Jones, and that's not the case. I have nothing personal against Daniel Jones. But what I've been saying for literally months now is that if the Giants were that convinced about Daniel Jones as their future, why would they do, this heavy due diligence? Why would they say, okay, hey, New England, call us if you're thinking of moving? Hey, is everybody okay if we traded up or got Jaden Daniels? If they, look, think back to when Eli Manning was here, okay? Do you ever recall hearing or reading about the Giants thinking about trading up in the first round to get another quarterback when Eli was, still relatively young? No, they didn't. You don't just give up assets just for, the heck of it, just because you're like, oh, okay, we've got to protect ourselves because Daniel, has an injury history. I get that. I get that that's part of the factor. But that also tells me that there's still some hesitation about Daniel and him being potentially the franchise quarterback moving forward. Not necessarily all tied into whether or not Daniel can perform, but the injury history, the inconsistency in the performance, all that factored in. And had the Giants been able to trade up and get Jaden Daniels or Drake May, you know what, folks? That would have been the end of Daniel Jones. He would have played this year because he's got the guaranteed money. But next year, that would have been it. I'm convinced of that. And that's why I've been saying all along that, if you're a team and you're that confident that your quarterback, that you've got the quarterback of your future and you've got no questions whatsoever, you don't do what the Giants did. That's why I said the injury factor was a big one and just the overall questions. Now, that said, everything worked out in Daniel Jones's favor. They didn't get a quarterback. They got him a weapon. They got him better offensive linemen. Dable's going to take over the play calling. No more excuses. It's put up or shut up for Daniel Jones. Hopefully he puts up. Okay? I want to see a winning team. I'm tired of coming on this show every Monday and having to talk about a losing effort. I'm sure you all want to see a winning quarterback, but it's up to Daniel to make it happen. Will he? Well, that's something Card Knocks won't cover, although I think in the next episode, we'll see the draft. We'll probably see a little bit about Daniel Jones's recovery. Again, this is just my guess. And then I'm sure, by the time we get to episode 5, we'll get even more into that because that's when they'll turn probably to the OTAs and the practices and stuff like that. So that all being said, that's your recap. Those are my takes. Hope you enjoyed the show. As always, thank you so much for tuning in to the Locked On Giants podcast and spending part of your day with us. Don't forget to keep it here all week long. The Giants rookies in training camp. They are in the house for their week-long orientation. Regular training camp starts next week, and we're going to have shows for you whenever there's a practice. So make sure you keep it here. Until tomorrow, Giant fans, have a good one. Talk soon.